Hi there, I'm Colin Hart. Welcome to Bodhrán Around the Globe. I'll be your instructor for today, and we'll be looking at the wonderful musical tradition of Mambo. As you know, my background, I'm a musician, an educator, and an ethnomusicologist. So that informs some of the lessons that we'll be having here. In particular, we'll be looking at Mambo. I teach a large West African percussion ensemble, and prior to focusing on West Africa, we looked at different musics from around the Caribbean and Latin America. And so one of the traditions we looked at was Mambo. And we were looking at that across a variety of percussion instruments, but particularly thinking about the conga, the bongos, maracas, the guiro, the cowbell, and also putting some drum kit in there as well. We ended up teaming up with a big band to perform some mambo, and of course the timbales as well, which was great. And so, what I'm hoping with these lessons is to not only encourage you to perform these different rhythms on the bodhrán, if you want to include them into traditional musics where you see appropriate, that's great, and maybe something non-traditional for the bodhrán, so maybe in a jazz setting or folk setting or percussion ensemble, etc. When thinking about the rhythms I'm going to present here, you can think about this in playing with other instruments that are non-percussion and playing these rhythms. You can think about playing them just on your own to kind of map them out, figure out what works. There's going to be a variety of different rhythm patterns we're going to explore that happen at the same time. So it's polyrhythmic is the nature of these percussion compositions. And so you can figure out different ways to map them on the drum. And I'm going to go over some of them, but you can really experiment with them and kind of see what works for you. And it depends on the setting and kind of your own musical choice. So that's really important to think about. As a teaching tool, as the educator in me, using the frame drum to play some of these non-traditional rhythms is really interesting and really works well in engaging students to think about mapping these or orchestrating them on a different instrument, being comfortable with the rhythm patterns themselves, but figuring out different timbres to get out of the drum, where to place them on the drum head or on the side, etc., bass, middle, treble, etc., when playing these rhythms, which is a lot of fun. The third way to kind of do this as well is to, well, there's two ways really, more than that. One is to kind of have a mixed percussion ensemble if you're teaching, say, a class where everyone has learned, say, the mambo rhythm patterns, and then to break from those, congas, bongos, drum kit, etc. And once they're comfortable with those rhythm patterns, to introduce the frame drum for them to figure out their own rhythm pattern and how to play that and to get creative with that using different sticks, tippers, brushes, etc. And then switching the parts. So you can have all the frame drums doing that, where everyone's on a frame drum and you're playing through these different parts polyrhythmically, so at the same time, these different rhythm patterns. Or you can have it mixed, meaning that some people remain on an instrument they're comfortable with, say the congas, and maybe someone else who wants to be pushed and encouraged more, try a different percussion instrument, can try the bodhrán or the frame drum, whatever you have your hands on, ability to teach. So you can do this in a group setting. You can do it individually. You can do it with non-percussion instruments. You can do it with a variety of world percussion instruments, or you can do it just with the frame drum. So from there, we'll dive into Mambo, okay? So Mambo is a great tradition. It originally comes from a variation on the danzón, which comes from Cuba. It was sort of the improvisatory riffing portion of the end of the danzón, which is sort of a couples dance, which came over from Europe and then was changed over time to incorporate different Afro-Cuban rhythms. And Mambo brought that to the fore even more so. So Mambo became quite popular. It incorporated some of the montunos from son. So these are sort of ostinatos or repeated rhythm patterns that you find in the rhythm section, particularly bass, percussion, the different percussion instruments I listed, and piano. So that'd be repeated while the horns or string instruments or voice, etc., were performing melodic patterns. And there would be some more improvisation in there as well. So this becomes quite popular, through the 30s into the 40s. It makes its way up into New York, particularly. There was a wave of immigration from Cuba, particularly to New York City. And by the 1940s and 50s, when you have the big band era as well, you have a mambo craze, and so you have a nice marriage between big band jazz and arranging, and these Afro-Cuban rhythms and ideas of how to incorporate these two into one musical form. So the rhythms of mambo, so the melodies, the harmonic ideas, coupled with jazz and the big band arranging. Perez Prado was one of the most famous for popularizing this, which led to a giant mambo craze. Of course, the great Tito Puente, the king of the timbales, Tito Rodriguez, etc. There's a whole host of musicians that popularized this in the U.S. In the 50s, have a huge mambo craze. Just in terms of exercise, or if you just love listening to mambo and percussion music in general, there's millions of great recordings. In terms of just percussion, which is great just to play along with and pick out different patterns and think about mapping these on the drum, is Tito Puente and Percussion, which is a great album. I think it's 1956. And then Top Percussion, which I believe came out in 1958, I want to say with RCA. But you can find those still today. Great recordings and great opportunities to practice these. So we'll take just thinking through these, and I'm going to give you some suggestions for mapping them out. So you have the clave. We talked about this last time, right? So you have a 3-2 clave, which is right? Or you can do the 2-3, which is now, when you're mapping this out, in my head, obviously I'm thinking clave sticks, and I'm also thinking possibly being played on the bell as well. So if you like to, you can play it on the shell. You can mute that with your body and have that going. So that's always in the music. You're thinking that, you're feeling that. If you want to put it on the drum head, you could mute it so your hand is up here. So you got this kind of sound where I'm filling that in. Or you're going to, or those patterns are nice, and you can really think about mapping them. You know, if you want to go into the bass as well, you do. So if you want to fill that in as well, you can do that and think about it in the bass, which I prefer it up top just because in my head I'm thinking that more as a bell, the clave stick patterns as well. But that's nice. So that's one pattern you can have a student do, or you can have yourself do while you're playing along. And it's nice to, especially if you're listening to different mambo recordings, to be able to pick out that clave. To always, the clave meaning the key, that it kind of keeps everything in line. You always align to the clave. So once you have that in your head, you can kind of figure out which patterns work well. Now, typically you'd have a steady maraca pattern there as well. I like to just use a jazz brush, but you can use something else to give that kind of shaker sound. And that's just doing steady A's. There's a nice sense of movement to it, but you're not going, it's not that swung. It's pretty straight there. Okay. What we hear there is the guiro pattern. Now, some people like if you have a nice Seamus O'Kane barron that has those little tacks going around it to hold the skin in, you can get that, and you can even go further down, and you get that rip, 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 that sort of sound, which is nice. If you want to do that, it's a little tougher to do if you don't have that, obviously. You could do a scraping sound there. It's not as effective. But that's something to think about as well if you want to include that, which is great. another way to map this out. So if we're thinking about the conga pattern, right, we have boom, boom, pop, pop, boom, boom, boom. Okay? So sort of a close, if we're thinking about this. Now, if you want to get, so you have your 1N, 2N, 3N, 4N. Okay, so you have that ringing sound. You can even do open if you wanted to. You can do. So you could have that there if you want to get a ringing sound for this 2N, meaning 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Now, if you want to even get kind of map this out even more, you can put the hand muted in the middle, so it's. So that's with the open there. Now, for the top part, if you want to press in to get that high end, you can do that, or you can take the hand off and just use the thumb there. Get some overtones there, so you get. You raise that up just a little bit more, you can still get that ringing sound. So. So you can think about that, just mapping that out. You could, you don't have to keep that as rigid as middle high, middle low. You can also speed these up and slow them down based on the musical context, Okay, so that's sort of the conga pattern. That's one of them. Obviously, there's a bunch of variations for Mambo. There's different rhythm patterns that sneak in there and different ways to kind of mix it up. This is just sort of the basics, but I think it's interesting just to kind of think about how these fit together, particularly on the drum. Whether you're doing that ringing sound, we get those overtones where you're muting. If you're just doing a high hit, so you have that sort of sound, or maybe just a little lower. Sort of a woody sound there, and then that low end. So boom, boom, bop, bop, boom, 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 bop, bop, boom, 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 bop, bop, boom, boom, boom. Okay, so once you get that down, it's great to think about as well. Another pattern, which is the bongo pattern, which is you have 1 and 2 and 3 and boom, boom, bop. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, if you want to, let's say we switch up the tippers to try and get more resonance there. And, if you're listening to a recording, you really like how those bongos are tuned, you can try and, using your ear to kind of match it on the drum as close as possible. If you're playing slower and you just want to do those sort of hits, there you go. That, or you can do back and boom, 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 back and forth like that. Now, obviously, the bongos are pitched higher than the conga. So the conga has a wider range. Bongos, typically, you would be playing on the smaller head, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And that's why it drops. Also lines up with the pattern when you think about the conga, where it's going boom, boom, pop, pop, boom, 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 boom. When it goes boom, boom, the bongos are also going. That's when they're at their lowest as well. So they align there. But for 1 and 2 and 3 and it's typically staying up here. So that's something to think about as well. If you're playing along with other percussionists, also think about little fills if you want to do as well, trying to incorporate that. but really trying to keep these rhythms steady. And there's Mambo is pretty up tempo, so once you have these down at a regular tempo, it's important to think about getting these up to speed, playing along, and trying to get the different timbres and tones out of this drum, and trying to be consistent with it. Just trying to, if you're going up high, you're getting that nice, and then making sure you get the nice tones here, bass, so that they're mapped out in different ways. Once again, you can take this pattern. You get that? Or you can just even more muted. You can kind of mess with that, whether you want to get that open ring sound or just this. How much bass? Even if you don't end up playing Mambo with other percussionists, I think it's important, developmentally speaking, to take these and map them out in different ways, because you become more comfortable moving around the drum and thinking about different patterns in different places, and also giving you different ideas for accompaniment when you're the only percussionist. Of thinking about, well, maybe I start maybe with the melody in the second part of the piece moves up, you can then think about and kind of thinking about these ways of creating different percussion or percussive accompaniment patterns. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email, which will be at the end of this video. I've included a little lesson just that I presented on for music education conferences and ethnomusicology conferences, and I included the shot of just a very brief clip from the classes I taught, percussion classes I taught, where it's mixed. There's students on different percussion instruments, including the bodhrán. So it's very short, but you can at least get an idea of maybe how to incorporate this into your own teaching or playing or organizing this. But anyway, so it's there. If you're interested in the history of the bodhrán, there's a book coming out that I wrote called The Bodhrán, Experimentation and Innovation in the Traditional Irish Frame Drum. You can find that at the University of Tennessee Press, so that should be in a link below. And also, if you are interested, there's another great article in Ethnomusicology Forum about the maker Seamus O'Kane and his contribution to the world of bodhrán making and playing, which I also wrote. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. I hope to see you again. Thank you. Ready, go.